So let's see, as I was saying, I believe talked about the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So just from the remains in Germany of some of the few buildings and some of the places. This is a Holocaust memorial. Yeah, I think I covered this stuff. I might have gotten us to here. This is actually in the Czech Republic. There's a museum of communism. Goes over, well, a lot of the details of when the Czech Republic was taken over by the Soviet Union. Remember, all of Western Europe, even though the country still kind of kept, well, countries like what was Czechoslovakia at the time, and now is the Czech Republic and Slovakia, two separate countries. These countries that were in the Warsaw Pact, they were under the control of the Soviet Union, but they weren't members of the Soviet Union like the countries that we'll be talking about on Wednesday. So they had their independence, but they didn't really have their independence. Russification. Now I am remembering that I did talk about some of this last time. Russification meant that not only, Russia was in control of the Soviet Union, and Russia was also culturally in control of the Warsaw Pact, and any countries that were on that side of the Iron Curtain. And what that meant was not just that there were resources that were taken for Russia, but even though it was called itself the Soviet Union, it's more accurate to think of it as an empire, because the steps they did were more like what empires do. Empires technically will have like a ruling city, in this case Moscow, right? And areas that they take over, they will take people from that ruling area and put them in those places of management within the different countries. And so this is what Russia did during this period of time. This was in a museum. This is supposed to be what kind of like a normal dorm room was like during the Cold War. This is an interrogation room. But the local populations would be indoctrinated into the Russian culture, Russian language, Russian norms, right? These things were considered by the Russians to be superior to the other cultures, right? And it was also an effort to unify all countries that were under the control of the Soviet Union to have basically one dominant culture to them, right? As I said, this is what happens with many different empires through time, but this is, if you remember when we were talking about Ukraine and how there's areas of Ukraine that have large Russian populations, right? And if that was all confusing, lots of these countries still have the Russian populations. Many of them did not move back when the fall of when the Cold War was over, because they had already lived in these places for generations. These were their homes, you know. This is kind of like, well, if you go to Iran, you could find populations of Mongolian descent. And those are the populations that, when Mongolia had a large empire, distant populations helped to be local rulers of different places. When the empire fell, those populations didn't move back. And so you have that same type of thing. So that's why when they're looking at NATO and the different pressures and how likely it is for modern day Russia to invade these different countries, well, if those countries have large populations of Russian people who haven't lived in Russia for many years, for generations, but if they're in those countries, that seems like it's more likely a place that they would go into. Again, this is just a museum of what life was like before the revolution. All right. So jumping topics a bit, religion in Europe. Religion in Europe has been going through lots of changes. Historically, of course, it has gone through lots of changes. It's predominantly known as a Christian region, but obviously there was a time before that when it was largely not. It had lots of different, what you call traditional religions in different places. Like I said, a lot of you know this stuff, but Christianity also didn't start in Europe, right? It's not from there. It diffused into there. mostly by a lot of people coming around and spreading the gospel. It wasn't spread that much along trade networks compared to other religions that we've studied. A bit more hierarchical in that people traveling, well, they go to places that were big ports, because that's where they had a lot of circulation, and it was easy for them to get transportation. Number of different splits of Christianity through time. Very often these splits happened because of political reasons rather than the local population deciding on the splits. Except for possibly, if you want to think about the Roman Catholicism and Protestant Reformation split. But again, these splits, basically one of them split Europe into East and West, the other somewhat into North and South, in very broad strokes. And then somewhat interestingly, the diffusion of Christianity that happened throughout the rest of the world, again, didn't happen predominantly from where it came from, but from Europeans who spread out across the world, right? Kind of unique dispersion. Religions in Eastern Europe, again, you can see both a bit of that east-to-west divide as well as the north-south divide. A lot of people kind of think Germany is all Protestant, but actually Germany has a lot of Roman Catholicism. Let's see what else can I point out about this. You can also see somewhat of the historical lineage of when the Ottoman Turks took over large areas of Europe for many years. You see less residue in modern populations of the Moroccans who would come in, but you'll see it in the architecture if you visit Spain. You know, sometimes I've taken a couple different censuses of class and how much students have traveled. And unfortunately, I think because of the pandemic, there's a lot less student travel than there used to be. Maybe sometime in the future you'll be able to travel more. All right, so those are some of the classic divides. As I was saying before, religion is going through lots of changes, and the most recent one in Europe is secularism. If you remember this part from the chapter, it's very interesting how things have changed. And the book mentions a number of different reasons for that change being, well, the book hypothesized relative affluence of European society means less struggle for survival in previous generations, make them less religious. European values have become very liberal through time, especially compared to their relatively recent past. Europe had been historically a very conservative place for generations and generations. After the Second World War, there was a bit of not a small wake-up call to the realization that the old ways had kind of nearly destroyed themselves as a population, right? So there was a big changeover afterward. A lot of the sexual abuse controversies among clergy, that has also been part of the rise of secularism. Lots of different things going on in Europe. When it comes to where the hearth of secularism is in Europe, you could say it's pretty solidly centered in, you could center it in the city of Paris, you could center it in France. That is the country that has kind of leaned the most into it ever since the French Revolution. When we get to Eastern Europe and we talk about how when the communists took over, the communists specifically had an atheist doctrine, and part of that was tied up in the fact that local monarchies were very tied to the local churches, right? They went hand in hand. So if places wanted to rise up and destroy the monarchies, very often they felt the need to also destroy the local church connections, right? Destroy the supporting mechanism behind it. So when the French Revolution happened, the French Revolution was against the monarchy, of course, as I'm sure you all know. But it also became against the church to some extent. You know, and I don't know what they're going to do, because it's not just less people going to church, but people who want to be priests and pastors and work for the church is also declining at such a large rate. A lot of the churches have started kind of selling off properties, and people have started kind of rehabbing smaller churches to serve as different functions, sometimes homes, sometimes businesses, very often theaters, things like that. It's kind of interesting times. Graph from the book, well, a chart looking at, well, if you're going to say, again, which countries are the most secular, which are the less. Interestingly, Russia, a lot of places in the East, because they had been forced basically to be atheists, there's still a lineage of a lot of secularism in those areas, but after the fall of communism, there was actually a great increase of people going back to church and trying to rediscover their roots. Let's see, what else can I point out in this chart? That's about it. So anyway, that's a trajectory that Europe has been going through time. And the younger generation is even more secular than the older generations. Already kind of talked about this when we were looking at the map. The spread of Islam within Europe. Again, it's often past empires that have kind of come and gone. And you know, interestingly, there are lots of places within Europe where, in Spain, for example, they kept a lot of the Islamic architecture, and sometimes they would convert them to being Christian churches and whatnot, but they wouldn't actively seek out and destroy these structures and buildings. But in other places, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, lots of these places, the Christians specifically try to destroy the churches and the infrastructure that have been left over from previous Islamic peoples. So it's kind of like very, very different thing, but that's not unusual for lots of empires and whatnot to try to actively destroy signs of other groups that have been in a place. Well, like I said, if you get the chance to travel, Cordova, Spain, beautiful place. Portugal also has some of the older architecture, not as much as Spain. Only remaining mosque in Belgrade, just one left that has not been destroyed. Traditional Norwegian church. Actually Norway has lots of these old traditional wooden churches. They make the news every now and then just because they are still very flammable, and they often will go up in flame because they are fully made out of wood. Politics and religion. Well, in a nutshell, it might be unusual for you to think of as Americans, we have somewhat of a divide between the state and religion, but there are plenty of countries where your tax money goes directly to fund specific religions, right? If it's a state-sponsored religion, right? The U.S. doesn't have a specific state-sponsored religion. Religions can get tax breaks, so it's kind of de facto covered by taxes, but not specific churches. But in many countries, you'll have a specific state church that your tax dollars go to support that church. Just something kind of unusual. What else can I say about this? Poland, well, during the Cold War and while they were behind the Iron Curtain, most of their kind of rebellion was centered around and organized through the church. So they've had a very strong connection to their church, even during the time that it was technically illegal and people weren't allowed to be religious. It was still an underground movement that eventually took part of the emergence of religion in some of the Eastern European countries. Let's see. As I mentioned before, France and the French Revolution kind of being the hearth of secularism in the region. That's still in evidence today. France is very aggressive as far as mandating secularism. So in schools, you're not allowed to wear religious garments or things that can be seen as religious. Every now and then you might see on the news there'll be a French beach where someone will get a fine for wearing too much clothes, right? If they wear a veil and whatnot, that might be technically against the law in some places, right? So they're very, very in the kind of forefront of pushing the secularism envelope. It's interesting because there's a good chapter, well, a good amount of this is talking about Turkey, which that's actually always a bit of controversy of how much Turkey should be included in a chapter on Europe. Because geographically, it's right there, right, in the area that you would normally consider just to call Europe from a pure physical geographic standpoint. And Turkey would like to become part of the European Union, but they haven't been able to change their election laws enough, and a couple other things. When European countries, when countries try to become part of the European Union, there are certain things that they have to be able to do. Certain amount of development technologically, but also as well as the democracy that is in play. Part of the reason that Turkey does come up in this chapter is because there's been a lot of immigration into European countries from Turkey, and this has kind of strengthened the bond between the rest of Europe and Turkey. Let's see. Anything I should say? Well, currently this is more modern day things. Turkey has mostly been secular historically, but they're moving a little bit away from secularism. But this is still like a recent enough thing that I don't know if we could really see a term happening from it.
I have a question.
Oh yeah.
Does that scare people in Poland and in Central Europe that Turkey is moving away from secularism into more like pro-Islamic philosophy?
I mean, I don't know if it specifically bothers people in Poland.
Central Europe, Eastern Europe.
If people in Eastern Europe specifically,
Greece, Romania, Serbia.
Oh, neighboring countries definitely, yeah. Neighboring countries, I would say Europe is always a bit on high alert about any kind of countries that would mandate any kind of specific beliefs on their population, right? So they're kind of on high alert about that kind of thing. Yeah. There's not like a lot of active things going on about it. I mean, Turkey's been kind of not thought of well by Europe. Ever since there's been some problems, for example, there's a very famous journalist who was murdered in Turkey.
By Saudi Arabia, which the Turkish people themselves exposed.
Yes. Oh, yes. But it's still it's seen as how did that happen kind of a thing.
So when CIA agents die in London, you don't see people asking, "Oh my God, how did Russia manage to infiltrate into London?" But when something happens that's like
Wait, go to your previous example when the CIA does what?
like a CIA agent dies in London.
Yeah.
You don't see people holding the United Kingdom like, "Oh my God, how could that happen within the borders of the United Kingdom?" And this is like when, for example.
Oh wait, let's back up. So you're saying the journalist was a CIA agent? No, the journalist is a journalist, right?
I'm trying to make a point.
Okay.
The point I'm trying to make is Jamal Khashoggi was a Saudi Arabian citizen.
Yeah.
Who Saudi Arabia themselves killed.
Oh yeah.
In Turkey.
Oh yeah.
But when things I understand that throughout the world, it's like, okay, how could that happen inside of Turkey? But when multiple things throughout the Cold War that we're learning about right now, when multiple things happened where different types of agents die in different cities throughout Europe, you don't see people saying, "Oh my God, how could that happen in France?" or how could that happen in England? So it's like, just the point I'm trying to make is, I feel like Turkey gets a bad rep because of their Islamic past, with the Ottomans and this and that. And sure, like things that they did, like the Janissaries, like the things that they did that are despicable.
Sure.
That being said, it feels like Islamophobia all over, from my perspective.
Well, of course, Islamophobia is bad, and of course it exists and it happens. But this is a recent thing, and it was a horrific murder of a journalist. I believe when that happens in any other place, it is also a big news story. Yes. I would say, though, that there has been a history of part of the reason Turkey has not been embraced by Europe is a history of that Islamophobia, definitely. But I still, this recent thing, I would be worried about downplaying its significance for what it was in itself, you know. Man. That's my 2 cents, I guess. All right. Language in the state. You know, it's kind of interesting because when we look at a map of European languages, there must be one here, right? Oh, it's a very generic map. More specific map. When we look at this, it seems like a place that has a diversity of languages, right? And it does. I mean, compared to Europe, the U.S., right? It's many different languages. But interestingly, before the printing press, there used to be a lot more dialects within places, and there still is a fair amount. But the printing press and then local state governments disseminating these through schools and whatnot really kind of standardized a lot of languages in a way not dissimilar to what the internet does today with English, and a lot of people feeling like they need to learn some amount of it because of how much it is used, right? And then through time, people, that just kind of become the norm. To the point that, you know, this chapter actually talks about France being very aggressive when English words are used too much, making a big effort. So for example, many years ago, there was a time when, well, I don't know if people really buy CDs anymore. People will buy CDs sometimes, you probably just buy your music online. But CDs, you know, standing for compact disc, when people were calling CDs in France, the government stepped in and required that places that were selling them to use a French term, which I don't remember what it is now, another term for compact discs. But some countries will be very aggressive in those ways. France has a very kind of a national character that they are trying to kind of maintain against the onslaughts of kind of globalization pressures. What else can I say about languages before we get here? One interesting thing about English, well, England itself has been taken over so many times by countries that were Germanic and then Germanic, Romantic, and it would be forced to change its language each time that this happened. That the English language actually has more words than many other languages. That's why, well, if you know English and you try to study another language, there'll be a lot of cognates. And that's part of the, like I said, it's part of the, because it went through so many different hands through time. And of course, you could see kind of the remnants of previous languages, right? You know, this map actually could have a little bit of the Celtic coloring here, because actually quite a few people in Ireland, when the English and Scottish invaded up here and a lot of population dispersed, a lot of them went directly here, and here as well. So this map, that part is accurate, but they didn't really do Portugal accurate. Let's see. That's good enough topic. Aging in Europe. similar to other places that we've looked at. You have an aging population, people are having less kids, so they are attempting a lot of social programs to increase, decrease the financial constraints to having children, right? And it's had like a mixed amount of success, kind of depending on the place. Total fertility rates here, some places are higher, some places are lower. After the fall of the Soviet Union, immediately in Eastern Europe, people started having less kids because when the Soviet Union fell, the social safety net also dissolved for a while. So when people are insecure about their future, they tend to not have kids, at least not as many. So population pyramids, which we've talked about plenty of times before. The term is population pyramid because that is how they were always traditionally were like a pyramid, right? With a larger, younger population. Now I would say they're mostly not like pyramids, although we still call them pyramids. They're mostly not. All right, got some population pyramids here. Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. This is 2020? Yeah. And you can see in general a larger, older population. And if it had not been for the many wars in the region, that would be a even larger, older population. Let me go to, you can see, if you look specifically at West Germany's population pyramid, right, we see kind of the opposite of what we see in lots of other countries, whereas we see a lot more women, right, a lot more women, and that is again a product of a whole bunch of wars, right, a whole bunch of wars, and those wars, they did affect both genders. Obviously, when there's mass bombings and whole cities are murdered, that affects both genders usually. But in general, the fighting population were more men. Migration in Europe. Let's see. As we saw in that population pyramid, a lot of guys killed during the war, right? A lot of guys killed. So it was actually relatively soon after the Second World War, as every place was rebuilding, that they wanted more people to come in and to work. And a lot of people that would come in for the temporary work visa, they'd often want to stay. And different countries would have different processes of how much they would allow or not allow that. This is actually quite a bit of controversy in lots of European countries. So there's lots of people who are against immigration, don't want immigration. I would say in general, we've got a map of immigration routes. In general, countries with higher unemployment rates tend to be the ones that are more anti-immigrant because they see that as taking jobs from their local populations. And unfortunately, those are all the countries that are the first countries that someone would have to go through. And usually the effort is someone is actually trying to pass by, and they don't necessarily want to get a job in Italy, Greece, or Spain that all tend to be a little more anti-immigrant, but they actually want to get to Northern Europe, which is where most of the jobs are, and in general they are more accepting of immigration, in no small part because they do have a labor shortage, still today. Let's see, anything else I can point out with this map? As you can see, it's a diverse range of countries that people migrate from, and very often these have specific colonial ties because people in the different countries may have been educated in that language, or there may be some connections of family who've already moved up there. Kind of depends on the individual country. There's all kinds of different scenarios going on. This chapter also talks about, when we talk about the Anthropocene, right? Anthropocene being that the earth is increasingly shaped by humans, right? One of the good examples in this chapter, is water in general. They have a number of different examples. But a good example, the Netherlands. The Netherlands, which I don't know if anyone's ever been to the Netherlands. Wonderful place, very picturesque. But lots of the areas that are land were areas that were reclaimed from the ocean, right? And so basically what you do is you put in a great big, something that's going to block the water, right? And what happens is, because you have fresh water coming in, you got rain or whatever, you got fresh water coming in through time. You put up a barrier so the salt water doesn't come in, let it be fresh water, let it go until basically all the salt's kind of been washed out, and then you fully block this so this area would then empty out. And it's often very good soil, because a lot of this area wasn't always the bottom of the ocean. A lot of these areas during past ice ages, when the sea level has been a lot lower, these were areas that were they got perfectly good soil because they're part of the natural surface soil process. So if you empty out the water, and this is with places that especially don't have a lot of land, like the Netherlands. It's a way to, and a lot of their newer developments and more popular places are places that were at the bottom of large bodies of water. And you can see that they still often will have canals going through and whatnot. Again, water and its effect on different places. I don't know if anyone's been to Venice. Venice is a beautiful place, but it was basically built in a swamp. Doesn't seem the ideal, stable place for architecture. I would say the architecture has been surprisingly stable throughout the years, but large parts of it are sinking. I got a picture here. Large areas are sinking, and although there are lots of places that would have normal seasonal floods, similar to other regions that we've studied, the flooding has become more and more pervasive and more of a problem. A lot of buildings specifically will have air bladders connected to different parts of their structure in the hopes that they won't sink. There have been more efforts lately to build up barriers for water and just pump the water out, which is an expensive process, but if you have your place that is flooding, that's what you're going to want to do. I mentioned before how these two chapters are a bit odd, because this chapter, which is basically on Western Europe, talks about Eastern Europe a lot. One of the examples is of Chernobyl. I don't know if anyone saw the HBO Chernobyl special. No? Well, Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a meltdown. At the time, this is before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and this is when most of Eastern Europe was very cut off as far as communication from the West, and there was not really a lot of oversight as far as things like nuclear power plants. Well, until something goes wrong, all right? Until something goes really wrong. And the reason that this isn't a chapter looking at Western Europe is because it did affect a large area. But at the time, there was a realization, even among the Soviets, that a lot of their nuclear power plants were using outdated technologies and did not have a lot of oversight. So there was a lot of different places that could have had problems. There was some amount of updating of these things, not a huge amount. Chernobyl. One of the last topics in this chapter is industrialization, the Industrial Revolution. It's weird that it's one of the final things that this chapter talks about, because it had a very strong effect on the region. Industrial Revolution, what does that mean? That's, in a nutshell, if you think about the factory system and mass producing things, right? Mass producing things. It's difficult in this day and age to not think of things being mass produced, right? Before industrialization, like let's say you wanted to buy a pair of shoes. Well, you would go to like someone who made shoes, and they would look at your feet and measure them, and they would make you shoes, and they would have expertise on all parts of a shoe, right? Industrial Revolution, factory system, well, that changes it. So like if there's a shoe in a factory, it's most likely someone will be at a machine, maybe pressing a button over and over, maybe doing one movement of the shoe, but it goes down an assembly line and someone else does another part. And so the way things are made is actually completely different than most of human history, right? Humans, so the Industrial Revolution was a difficult thing. A lot of people didn't want to work in factories because it was difficult labor that was also very alienating. When I say alienating, like if you think of a shoe, you know what shoes are, right? You know what they do. You know what you want your shoe to do. But people who make things these days, they usually are just part of a segmented process. Now, the good thing about the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, means that you can mass produce so that you can make a lot of things cheap, right? So at the time the Industrial Revolution started, there's basically a shortage of everything. This is part of the reason why trade would be at the barrel of a gun, because there wasn't a lot of these goods. And so they're very valuable. So with the Industrial Revolution, that meant that products would be made in a standardized way, right? Not so lots of bells and whistles or flair to things, very simple things, but a lot of it, right? So for example, you know, if you're going to a museum in Europe and you're looking at something like silverware, which doesn't sound like it's that complex, but the silverware will have been made by a specific artist, and it will have all kinds of little fancy things about it, right? Industrialization meant that you could have a factory that churns out tons of silverware fast, but it's all very standard and just very simple, right? Well, that's the industrialization process about everything. It kind of homogenizes everything, right? Mass production. So the Industrial Revolution, also remember, reason it was able to be successful in Europe so easily and so early is because they were getting all these resources from the rest of the world to make their stuff out of, right? Lots of resources from the rest of the world. So the Industrial Revolution, like many things, like the invention of agriculture, right, has a hearth, and then it has basically people next to where that is find out about it. Like, oh, this is actually a good way of doing things. And then you'll have people in the next area over, and it spreads through time. The Industrial Revolution and industrial processing and manufacturing, that also took time. Spread throughout Europe, you know, basically the center being right around London, as it expanded throughout other areas. One of the reasons it took a while for this expansion to happen is factories need large populations of people all concentrated in where they're living, right? You need a lot of people. Well, at the time, most people were living in rural areas and living in small towns, small communities, and very dispersed from one another. And it wasn't really until basically wages on rural jobs started being pushed down that people were then started moving to cities. And it was very similar to what we're seeing in the rest of the world now, where you have large populations that are moving to cities. Cities were not built up and ready for those populations. So you had large shanty towns, large amounts of homelessness. Very, like I said, very similar things that are happening in the rest of the world right now happened here in much the same way, very much the same way. I only know of one good documentary that talks about the Industrial Revolution. I might show it to you Friday. It's quite old. That's the only downside. But it does give you a good view of what the Industrial Revolution actually was. uh, tied with the Industrial Revolution, like I said, you need people living together, concentrated populations, right? And so that means urban. That's what the definition of urban is, right? A lot of people living together, usually with built infrastructure. And so, well, two urban revolutions in Europe, right? Thousands of years ago, with the invention of, well, that we studied every place else, agriculture, right? Allowed people to live in cities and do different things that weren't agriculture. Industrial Revolution, again, you needed people living in all these cities for it to be a system that's working. Now, when everyone started moving to cities, people started forming like guilds and mutual protection societies, and they started trying to push for local laws that protected workers, because there were no worker protections. Like if you worked for a place, a factory, like the person who managed it often just physically beat the people who worked under them because there was no rule not to. And if they were going to go work someplace else, that would just be someone else who would also do terrible things to them. So there wasn't a lot of choices, right? Well, yeah, transitions on society and cultural landscapes. This book talks about a couple different cities and a couple different ways that they changed through time. Again, you can just see the urbanization trends. And then population map of Europe. Again, you can see where there's high populations and low populations. High populations are the urbanized areas. Privatization of cities in Europe. This is interesting because this happened again after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the fall of communism. Beforehand, like housing, I got a picture of. Well, this is Prague in the Czech Republic. This is a picture from your book, so you've probably all seen it in your book. I actually wanted to add a couple pictures of this, of Prague in this area here, because this picture makes this look like this isn't an active place really, but like Prague is packed with tourists. If you ever want to go, these streets, as you can see, it's the same area, but usually there's packed with people. Right, you have a lot of this older architecture that is pre-industrial architecture. And again, Prague was one of the few cities that was not bombed as badly during the Second World War, so they're one of the few places that have a lot of that older architecture. Very popular place for tourists. Actually, this is just a Turkish restaurant. Since it was in the book, I thought I'd include just a couple pictures. Nothing too adventurous, but happened to be in Prague. So the book talks about how housing during the Soviet era, during the communist era, it was mass produced, right? Similar to when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, and you can make a lot of something, but there's no bells and whistles. The old architecture was very simple, but that is because they wanted to build as much of it as possible. After the Second World War, there was tons of people who were homeless because buildings had all been blown up. And so, yes, the buildings were simple, but they put a lot up in a short amount of time, right? Basically the industrial factory process for buildings. Since this picture was in our book, talking about how they've been kind of, colors have been added, and it talked about kind of the transition of these buildings in Prague, again, the Czech Republic. But actually, when I was there, there's tons of the older architecture that has not been kind of updated in any way. A lot of it is still the kind of drab, classic gray buildings. Kind of one of the more interesting buildings, if you go to the Czech Republic, this is actually an old TV broadcasting station from the Soviet era. It's now been turned into, I think, like a restaurant, but it's kind of one of the big things on the landscape in the area. So privatization, these big buildings that were built by the government, well, they were drab, they weren't well done, and often people didn't prioritize taking care of them because they didn't own them, they would rent them, right? So through time, there's an effort to privatize these buildings so that people would basically be in charge of them. And the hope was people would take individual efforts since you own it to like fix it up and whatnot. There's been some amount of that, more than zero, but it hasn't been like a big changeover or anything. This chapter also talks about world cities. We've talked about world cities a lot, but it also talks about world cities and that Europe currently has the highest number of what are classified as world cities. And that's mostly because, well, obviously a legacy of colonialism, right? A lot of these cities, they had wealth built up from around the world, but they also have global connections that were built up during that time that still exist. And like world cities around the world, in Europe, they have a lot of the same things. They tend to be more developed. They tend to be very diverse. They tend to have more of an international culture than their local cultures, right? If you go to Paris or London or Madrid or Lisbon, you will feel things are actually much more similar than if you go off to areas that are just outside of those cities. They'll be very different. It's kind of one unifying factor of world cities. Global financial sector, talked about this a bit already too when we talked about how Switzerland doesn't want to become part of the EU because then they would have people looking into those bank accounts. Banking industry in general is a bit like that. That's also one of the reasons why England has had such a contentious relationship with wanting to be part of the EU or not. They have a giant banking sector. Germany does as well. Germany's been more open about letting people look into their regulatory framework of their banks. So banking. Picture from the book. All right, well, we're a little short on time, but we're not too short. So I'm gonna have you work on a couple questions, but this time we're gonna do them individually. So I gotta make sure everyone is like understanding these concepts. So on an individual piece of paper, you can do it, I got faith in you. 2 questions, just 9 and 10. Just on your own. Bring it on up when you're done. But on your own.